Now, I'm going to watch this for a second, make sure it actually records after last week, and it seems to be good. So hopefully it won't stop all of a sudden. All right. So we're going to be going through Galatians Chapter 4. I probably will try to go through this very quickly. Again, I don't think there's, in Chapter 4, there's some things in here, but Chapter 2 and 3, I think, has a lot more, that takes a lot of building and a lot of explanation on. 4 definitely has its elements, but, and there's definitely a lot more time we could spend on some of this stuff, but let's just jump in. So it says, Galatians chapter 4, 1 through 3 says, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is an infant, differs nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all. But he's under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were infants, were in bondage under the elements of the world." So, okay, as I'm going to briefly summarize some of the things I talked about in the end of chapter 3. And that is a lot of the Jewish mysticism that's behind that, a lot of the mysticism that carries behind the notion of the image of God. What is the image of God? And that the Mashiach, or Christ, being that image. And how a lot of that text is actually talking about being restored to that image, and how the Torah, or the Bible, if you want to say it that way, is kind of the instruction manual that teaches you how to be restored to that image. And then we have the life of Yeshua to be a model to what that image looks like. So a way I can briefly summarize that notion, if you've ever bought model or furniture or something, and it comes with instructions, right? And it's unassembled. Well, you have a picture usually of what it looks like assembled, and then you have the instructions on how to get there. So what we have is the word. The word of God is the instructions, and the Mashiach, or Yeshua, is the model of what that looks like when you follow the instructions. It's a pretty simple notion, and you can see the truth of that in many avenues. I mean, sometimes people take the instructions and they don't really follow them correctly, and they end up with something that doesn't look like the picture at the end. Or they get to the end of the project and they're like, I have 5 extra bolts here. I hope that's not going to be a problem, right? And that's a lot of times what happens through life, because when we don't understand the Word of God correctly, we may end up with a couple extra bolts at the end, and we're like, we don't understand why we're having problems. Why is my life falling apart? Well, because those 5 extra bolts were actually pretty important, and you didn't read the instructions right, and you didn't put them in the right place. So instead of ending up at the Mashiach, you ended up as something else. It's a really simple concept. Not necessarily so simple to do, but a simple concept, and that's a lot about what the end of Galatians chapter 3 is speaking about. So now Paul's kind of building off that concept, but he's not really saying the same thing, because some translations talk about how he was talking about how the law is the tutor, and now people think now when he's going forward he's talking about the law still. And no, not really. It's more like teachers of the law, maybe, to a degree, or something to that effect. But then it was tutors singular. Now, or tutor singular. Now he's talking about tutors plural. So again, he's playing off the same idea, but he's now not relating the same idea. So we'd understand before that understanding the Torah as our teacher to help us arrive at the model, which is Yeshua. And but to get there, sometimes we need teachers or tutors and governors, people above us, elders, and those sorts of things to help us to reach there, right? So he gives this example of an infant, right? An infant represents somebody unlearned, somebody that doesn't know anything, right? Because a baby comes in the world and it doesn't understand anything. It needs to be taught. And who teaches an infant? Well, In a lot of ancient civilization, you did have people like tutors or governors. You had different people that may educate, if you were wealthy, educate your children. Kings had servants and things that would educate their children. And again, so this notion, when you didn't know anything, you needed people to instruct you. You needed instructors. Just like if you were becoming taking a trade work and you were going to become a carpenter, you would become an apprentice, right? An apprentice is basically like an infant. The apprentice doesn't know anything about carpentry, and he learns and eventually becomes a journeyman, and then he becomes a master. When he becomes a journeyman, though, at that point, he is a carpenter. Okay, he's not like an infant anymore. Now he's become that which he's learning to do. So when we're infants, we have teachers and instructors helping us to become that heavenly image, to be restored to that image we were created in. But once we arrive at that point, we don't need the same level of instruction. An adult doesn't necessarily need the same level of instruction that an infant needs through its course of growth in life. Verse 3, it says, even so, when we were infants, okay, so his implication is to not be infants anymore. You were in bondage under the elements of the world. And this phrase, the elements of the world, okay, so elements is this word stoicheia, and it's Strong's number 4747, and we're going to see what that means here in a second. So stoicheion, one of a row, hence a letter of the alphabet, by extension elements of knowledge. When you actually look down through the definition, actually short definition is a heavenly body, or plural heavenly bodies, a rudiment, an elementary principle or base element. But principally the way it was used in ancient Greek culture is that of heavenly bodies. So he's saying He's saying when you were in bondage under the heavenly bodies of the world, right? Because you were infants, you didn't know anything, you didn't know any better, so you thought the heavenly bodies were your gods, right? Pagan culture. This is a reference to pagan culture. But when the fullness of time had come, Elohim sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because you are sons, Elohim has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore you are no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of Elohim through Moshiach. So again, when the fullness of time had come, so at the appropriate time, Elohim sent forth his Son, right? And his Son was born of a woman. Who is his Son? His Word. His very Word is his Son, or the Spirit. And made of a woman under the law. Now that expression under the law is a pretty loaded statement. It's only ever used by Paul, and it's a highly confused statement, and there's just a number of ways it can be interpreted and has been interpreted over time. I'm not going to delve in that extensively here. I've dealt with it at other points. But when you use a simple definition, the understanding being as Paul's talking about here, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoptions of sons. He's talking about a process here, and it's pretty interesting because he says to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoptions of sons. Okay, so he doesn't say to redeem us that were born under the law, that we might receive the adoptions of son. That would be the typical pronouns that would be used in that expression. He doesn't say that. He says them. So the we that he's talking about later does not necessarily mean the them. The them may be a part of the we, but Paul is not including himself in part of the them. Does that make sense? If Paul was including himself as part of the them, like he is including himself as part of the we, bear with me here, he would say us, to redeem us that were born under the law. So in Paul's statement here, he is not seeing himself necessarily as one being born under the law. That's pretty interesting, I think. The correct pronouns would be us and we, not them and we. Now, are the them not included in the we? No, them are included in the we. They are receiving adoption as sons as well. Okay, next it says, because you are sons, Elohim has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So we need to explore that a little bit, and we're going to outlay some verses together. Wherefore, thou art no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then the heir of Elohim through Mashiach. But before we go forward, okay, as a son of God doesn't necessarily mean you're a full-grown son, does it? So if I go back here, and it says, now the heir, as long as he's an infant, differs nothing from a servant, though he is Lord of all. So now you're a son. That doesn't mean you're a full-grown son. So even though you're an heir, doesn't mean you differ from a servant, right? The logic applies both ways. So you're no more a servant. You're a son and an heir. But guess what? If you're a child, if you're an infant, even though you're an heir, you're no different than a servant. Okay? So that still means you're under tutors and governors. You still need teachers. The logic works both ways. Okay, now if you're a son and you're a full-grown son, you're a fully matured son, then no, you don't need teachers. But understand the logic that Paul built here works backwards and forwards. So maybe you were a pagan heathen and you didn't know anything about God, but now you're learning about God, and now you come and you receive the Spirit of his Son into your heart, and it's crying, Abba, Father, right? But you don't know anything because you're an infant. You're born again. You still need tutors. Still need teachers. Okay. To redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoptions of sons. 1 Corinthians 9:20 says, and unto the Jews I became a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law is under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. I missed part of the quotation, but it continues, to those without the law I became as one without the law. And so by definition, a Jew is not necessarily one that's under the law. A, because he says it here in Corinthians, and B, because as I pointed out, he talks about them that were under the law and the we that received the adoption, and therefore Paul does not see himself as one that was born under the law. Why? Because he was a Jew. And as a Jew, he became as a Jew. Why? Because he was a Jew, to gain the Jews. And then that are under the law is under the law, that I may gain them that is under the law. So here he's talking about becoming as one under the law. So by definition, that doesn't mean that he necessarily saw himself as one under the law. That should tell you a lot, that phrase is probably misunderstood in many circles. Now again, you could say, well, he was a Jew and he's talking about being as a Jew. Certainly, but again, I'm overlaying the two ideas. Verse 6, it says, because you are sons, Elohim has set forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. And we have Jeremiah 31:33. It says, but this shall be the covenant that I make with the house of Israel. And after those days, says Yahweh, I'll put my Torah in their inward parts and write it in their hearts. And where verse 6 says, the Spirit of his Son into your hearts. And Jeremiah 31:33 says, and write it in their hearts. And what does it say? And will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. And that word people is ami, and it could mean kindred or kinsman or family, right? And they shall be my family. And verse 6 says, the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father, right? Which carries implications of family. These verses are talking about the same notion. But the question is, in Jeremiah 31:33, it says, I will put my Torah in your hearts. And Paul's writing here in 6, he's saying the Spirit of his Son is in your heart. Well, that makes people think, well, this must be talking about two different things, instead of coming to the proper conclusion and saying, no, this is speaking about the same thing. The Spirit of his Son is the Torah written on your heart. Why? Because the written Torah is trying to transform you into that image. People want to go around talking about walking in power. You want to walk in power? Be transformed by the Torah into the image of God and walk as his son walked when he was here on the earth, which was a Torah observant Jew. You want to walk as a Torah observant Jew with faith, with belief that Yeshua is the Mashiach, with belief that he's the pattern and example for you to live in? Well, you'll have what you seek. Verse 8, how is it then that when you knew not Elohim, you did service, or in Hebrew we'd say avoda, unto them which are by nature are not gods? But now after you have known Elohim, or rather are known of Elohim, how do you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and times and years. I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. This is pretty interesting and pretty straightforward. So how is it when you knew not Elohim? When you didn't know God, you did service or you worshipped unto things that by nature weren't God. Idolatry, right? And in any of its forms, whether it's actually physically worshiping something carved from stone or brick, or whether it's, praying to your dead ancestors, or any other many forms. That maybe it's devoting your life to your job or to money, serving money rather than your Creator. Any forms that idolatry comes into, you did service to that, and that's what these people did. But it says, but now you have known Elohim. But more important than that, He knows you. Pretty big deal. You don't just know about Him, but that implies there's some sort of change now. You've entered into some sort of relationship with Him, and now He knows you too. You've been introduced. How do you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements which you desire again to be in bondage? Those agains are pretty important, because again, this is talking about people who didn't know God. So you cannot say that this is talking about legalism. You cannot say this is talking about the Torah. You can't even say this is talking by and large about Jews. This is talking about, Galatians is primarily written to Gentiles, not to Jews. So then he's talking about when they knew not God. So it's very clear here. He's talking about when you were pagans, when you were a bunch of heathens, when you were a bunch of people living your own life in your own way, under your own morality, under your own belief system. God didn't know you, but now you know Him. Why are you turning back to those things? So it's funny when people try and say this is referring to the Torah, and we know it's not, even by the statement observing days and months and times and years, which is the statement people see. This must be talking about the Jews in the Torah because they observe days and months and times and years. Not in the same sense. An observer of days or observer of times, from a scriptural perspective, isn't referring to a Sabbath or a new moon or a feast day. If that's what Paul was talking about, he would, just like in Colossians Chapter 2, he would actually say Sabbaths, new moons, so on and so forth. He doesn't. He's using different language here. And in fact, he's saying, I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed on you labor in vain. In other words, you going back to these weak and beggarly elements makes me feel like I've wasted his time. Why? Because Paul became teaching a Jewish faith with a Jewish Messiah to a pagan people. That's what he was doing. Book of Acts records it pretty plainly, that Paul remained a Torah observant Jew all of his life, all the way up to the end. And so to say that, now you're observing Sabbaths again on Saturday. Oh, I'm so afraid. That's just, when you even say it like that, it sounds dumb, to be honest. But that's what we have. So again, it says the weak and beggarly elements. Weak is Strong's number G772, and that's Esthenes, and it means infirm or feeble. Beggarly is Strong's number 4434, and it means, it's parakos, and it means lacking anything. And then elements again is stoichion, heavenly bodies. So weak and beggarly heavenly bodies, again referencing star worship, pagan worship. That's what they're returning to again. Now, some people say, well, these were being influenced by Gnostic Jews. And that's true. An example of a Gnostic Jew would be Simon the sorcerer, Simon Magus, and their belief in the aeons and worship of angels and stars and all these sorts of things. And maybe that was partly present there, but you didn't need to be a Gnostic Jew to believe this. There were Gnostic Greeks that didn't have any form of Judaism, and there were also just pagan belief. Roman belief, by and large, was worship of the stars. Mars, Pluto, Jupiter, they're gods. What do we call our planets? It's not, this isn't like that mysterious. We go in Galatians 4:8-11. So how is the Torah weak and beggarly? When we understand that, it means to be infirm or sickly, lacking, having nothing. If that's talking about the Torah, then we have some explaining to do, right? Got some explaining to do, Lucy. It just doesn't make sense. Here's Joshua 1:8. This book of the Torah shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate therein day and night, and that you shall observe to do all according to that is written therein. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall have good success. That sounds pretty weak. That sounds pretty beggarly. Prosperous? Most prosperous people I know are beggars, right? I mean, that's how they make all their money. They go around begging and they're millionaires. No, stupid. Doesn't fit. Shoe does not fit. 1 Kings 2:3. And to keep the charge of Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimonies, as is written in the Torah of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and whatsoever you turn yourself. Again, prosperous, not empty, no lack. I mean, you want a real prosperity gospel? How about that? How about you follow the Torah to the best of your ability in faith in our Creator and faith in Yeshua Mashiach, and see how well you do? It's a thought. Psalm 19:7 says, the Torah of Yahweh is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of Yahweh is sure, making wise the simple. The Torah is perfect, so it's complete, it's whole, it doesn't lack anything. That's what the Hebrew idea from perfect is. So Psalm 19:7 says, the Torah of Yahweh is perfect. It doesn't lack anything. So then Paul comes later and says that it's lacking. Never may it be. God forbid, right? Impossible. Because the scripture says it's whole, it's complete, it lacks nothing. And in fact, it can make simple people wise. So how is that weak? How is that beggarly? Psalm 37:31 says, the Torah of Elohim is in his heart, none of his steps shall slide. So again, if the Torah is in your heart, none of your steps shall slide. Doesn't sound like that's a bad thing. Psalm 119:72 says, the Torah of your mouth is better unto me than 1,000s of gold and silver. Weak, beggarly, poor. It's worth more than gold and silver. Doesn't sound poor to me. Proverbs 13:14. The Torah of the wise is a fountain of life. It's a fountain. It's full of water. It's full of life. To depart from the snares of death. Doesn't sound weak. Doesn't sound beggarly. You observe days and months and times and years. I'm afraid of you, lest I bestowed upon you to labor in vain. Deuteronomy 18:4 and many other places in the Torah say something similar. For these nations you shall possess, hearkened unto observers of times and unto diviners. But as for thee, Yahweh your Elohim has not suffered you to do so. See, by going back to their star worship, that actually was forbidden by the Torah, and that's why Paul was concerned. Astrology is the worship of stars and other heavenly bodies as deities, or the associates of deities with heavenly bodies. See that key word, heavenly bodies? The most common instances are the sun gods and moon gods in polytheistic systems worldwide. Also notable is the association of planets with deities in Babylonia and hence in Greco-Roman religion, viz. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. If you look at Acts, you'll find that there was a pagan population that was pretty large in Galatians, as we touched upon in the Galatians intro. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I as you are. You have not injured me at all. You know how through the infirmity of flesh I preached unto you the gospel at first, and my temptations which was in my flesh you despised not nor rejected, but received me as an angel of Elohim, even as Mashiach Yeshua. Where then is the blessedness you spake of? For I bear you record that if I had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and gave them to me. In other words, Paul is reminding them of when he first came to them and how it was, I believe, shortly after he was stoned. And I mean that like literally with rocks. After he was hit with rocks to near death, he came to him and he was in pretty bad shape. And the people had compassion on him. And then he was able to teach them. And they came to believe. And now they were, through pressure, they had Jewish people on one side, that some believed in Yeshua and some didn't. But they believed that unless they were circumcised or immediately and fully adhered to all the Torah at one time, that they couldn't be saved. And then you had a pagan population on the other side putting pressure, saying, why are you forsaking the ways of your ancestors? Why aren't you doing what we do? We've always celebrated Christmas, not literally, Yuletide. We've always done the Fooltide. Why don't you do it with us anymore? And they say, well, I don't know what to do. I got one people pushing me out and another people trying to draw me back in. And I know this is where I should be, but what state am I going to be in? So imagine how they felt. And Paul's writing to them to encourage them not to fall back to where it feels safe, not to forsake that which they've come to believe. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? They zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you that they might affect you. So again, there was, a Jewish populace, that was, some of them were pushing them out, right? But it's good to be zealously affected always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, of them whom I travail and birth again until Mashiach be formed in you, I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. Here again is that same idea that the Mashiach is the image of God, and the Torah is the way for you to be restored to that image, and Paul striving with them to make them an embodiment of that image. And that's what he's referring to. And he's basically saying, he knows that some people are pushing them out and some people are trying to draw them back, because there are multiple issues that Paul's writing about in this book of Galatians. To say it's all about Judaizers is a real lack of depth of actually looking at the text and comparing it scripturally and historically and contextually. He says, I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you. In other words, I'm concerned of where you're going. I wish I was there with you, right? Tell me, you who desire, this is supposed to be 21 through 25. Sorry. Tell me, you desire to be under the law. Do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondman and the other by a free woman. But he was of the bondwoman, was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which genders towards bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar, or Hagar, is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. Now, there's a number of things here, okay? So he's talking about them desiring to be under the law. That doesn't mean to be in submission to the Torah, okay? It's just implying that they were in one state, they were now not in that, and they should hear what the law says. And then he begins to tell a story, and I'm going to explain this a little bit. Hopefully it'll help make more sense. So he begins to make an allegory. He's not saying the story about Abraham recorded in the Torah is not factual, and it's only an allegory, and that's only purpose. He's saying, I'm making an allegory here from this story. And he's saying, from this story, I'm going to tell you about two covenants. Okay? Now, a lot of people believe this is Mount Sinai, and then the new covenant talked about in Jeremiah. I find that really doubtful for a number of reasons. It's far more likely he's talking about the covenant and the promise to Abraham and the covenant at Mount Sinai. If you want to believe that it's talking about the new covenant, you can. It doesn't really change anything I'm about to say. But with that, I will say this. Again, people may say, well, this is talking about covenants, and Abraham had a promise. Well, no, Abraham had a covenant too. If you don't believe that, go back and read the scriptures. But also from God's perspective, a promise and a covenant are not much different. The difference between a promise and a covenant from God's perspective, because remember, God will not lie, and God will do that which he says. So a promise is not relational. In other words, a promise doesn't necessarily imply anything on your part. A covenant is relational, and it implies something on your part. That's the only real difference between a promise from God's perspective and a covenant from God's perspective. They're both sealed. God is good as his word. But God does ratify that promise to Abraham with a covenant. And so you have a covenant represented by a promise, right? And if that's not what Paul's talking about here, then why would he use the language he did? One was born after the flesh, one was born by promise, and these are two covenants, okay? One from Mount Sinai, which is Hagar, right? And Hagar, and it says, which genders towards bondage. You got to understand this. That word gender, it doesn't say the Torah puts you in bondage. It doesn't say the Torah is bondage. He says it genders. It has a tendency to cause bondage. And the reason why the Torah has a tendency to cause bondage is because A, when you don't have God's understanding of it, and B, when you don't have faith, you will make a mess. Many Christian denominations, many cults throughout history, many people have used the Word of God as a weapon and to manipulate people and to create, all kinds of things. That's a fact. We know that's a fact, that the Torah, as recorded and given on Mount Sinai, can lead people into bondage. It's not bondage. God didn't give it as bondage. God gave it to set you free. But it can lead towards bondage, and that's which genders towards bondage means. And we know that he's saying that this corresponds to Jerusalem, which is now and is in bondage, which it was. It was under Roman oppression, and there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of Jewish sects at the time, and there was a lot of just confusion amongst the leaders. But to do this, we need to go into the story now to explain why is Paul making this allegory. What does this mean? Well, you had two children, one born by promise, which means by the Spirit of God, right? The Spirit of prophecy. God spoke forth that this would happen, and we know Genesis 18:10 says this. And he said, I will certainly return unto you according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard in the tent door, and she was behind him. So God gave the promise, Sarah, your wife shall have a son. So that's what, to do things by the Spirit, to do things by the promise, would be to believe that, have faith in God's word, and continue in that, abide in that. But what did Abraham do? In Genesis 16:3, and Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her handmaid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave to her husband Abram to be his wife. Right? So that's what it means to do things after the flesh. It means to take something God said and to try to do it your own way. And that's what was happening in the first century. People were doing things God said in their own way, or under their own interpretations, or even rejecting what God had said and doing things their own way, and even to this day. So to do things after the Spirit would mean to do what God says. So to say that that means not following his written word, which are the words of God, would be preposterous. Doesn't make sense. In fact, the implication would be to do those things with faith and abide in them until you get the results that you expect. right? And it continues, but Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all, for it is written, rejoice thou barren that bear not, break forth and cry, you that travaileth not, for the desolate have many more children than she that hath a husband. For now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, the brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but the free. There's a lot I could go in, and I may backtrack on this later, especially with some of the midrash. But I'm going to give 2 points based off this. 1, children born of the flesh are not, by definition, strictly Jews. They would be anybody that falls into that representation of doing either God's thing their way or rejecting God and doing things their way. It could be just as much a pagan as it could be a Jew that had rejected Yeshua as Mashiach. Can equally be both. He's saying, but we are, brethren, are as Isaac, are children of the promise. In other words, those that have faith in the words of God, those that believe even in his Mashiach and his coming, and those that believe specifically from Paul's perspective that Yeshua is the Mashiach. Anyone that falls outside of that category from Paul's perspective is not a child of the promise, even if they were born naturally a Jew. That's Paul's perspective. It's written over and over again through all his writings. And once you can start to see that, and once you can train your mind to pick that up, you will find that consistently throughout his scriptures, that his concern is Gentile believers that he's teaching coming into a Jewish faith and rejecting Yeshua as the Messiah and thinking that they just being Jewish is sufficient, yet denying the Mashiach that brought them. And then the other aspect again is also too, people being deceived by vain philosophies, the minds of men, Greek thinkers, Greek, like Epicureans and such, or various forms of Gnosticism, and being led off into another form of incorrect thought. And so that's the heart of really what Galatians is about. And thankfully we only have 2 more chapters, and at some point I'll double back and fix the end of 3 there. So hopefully that's informative.